Hello, and welcome to a new episode of Classical Music Composition. Today we'll talk about one of my favorite musical genres of all time, the theme and variations, which consists in the repetition of one given theme through a series of variations, but each time sounding in a different way, making each one of them different and unique. In this video, I'll give you a few tips and guidelines, from basics to more advanced ones, that might help you compose more interesting theme and variations, or improve your already composed ones, whether this is your first time adventuring in this fun genre or not. Choosing a theme. There are two things to keep in mind in order to pick the right initial theme for a theme and variations. First one is the form. Unlike with fugue subjects, which can be built on just a few bars of music, in a theme and variations we need a proper thematic structure, which can be set either as a binary or rounded binary form, being the latter the standard choice within the classical music period. This is an example of rounded binary form, a popular Dutch tune, which Mozart used as theme for a set of variations, written as kid during a trip to the Netherlands. Here we've got an initial 6 measures long theme which ends on a perfect authentic cadence. Next, we've got a contrasting middle section, which encompasses another 6 measures, divided in 2 repetitions of 3 bars long units, each one ending with a half cadence on the dominant. And finally, the reprise of the initial theme, which could be varied, but in this case is literal. This is what I call the long rounded binary form, in which every section has the same or close number of measures, but there are other possibilities as well. Like in this case, the initial theme from Mozart's Piano Sonata No. 11, which first movement is structured as a theme and variations. This theme, which was most likely borrowed by Mozart from somewhere else, starts as an 8 measures long compound period, consisting of 2 4 measures long sentences that behave as antecedent and consequent, the first one ending on a half cadence, and the second one on a perfect authentic cadence. Then it follows a 4 bars long contrasting middle section. And then a partial reprise of the initial theme, in which only the second half is repeated, yet expanded through this 2 bars long cadential extension, leading to a 4+2 structure. This is what I call a short rounded binary form, in which the length of the contrasting middle section and the reprise of the initial theme are equal or close to half the length of the complete initial theme. Keep in mind that these names allude to the length ratio between sections, and not absolute bars numbers. For instance, this short rounded binary form has the same number of measures than the previous example, which was a long rounded binary type. The second thing to keep in mind is the actual musical content of the theme. Ideally, it should be simple and easy to remember, making it easy for the listener to recognize its musical motives throughout the whole set of variations. If you want to compose your own initial theme, don't worry about it not being astonishing enough. It's best to keep things simple, or there will be not enough room for the variations to add complexity later. So, should the initial theme be original or borrowed? While there are no fixed rules with regard to this topic, it's safe to say that a high amount of the theme and variations composed in history were based on pre-existent tunes, and for good reasons. Borrowing an existing theme has its advantages, especially if it's an already popular and well-known tune that people will recognize instantly, even in the form of highly elaborated variations. This practice also carries other intertextual implications, such as when composers use this as a form of tribute towards whoever they borrowed the music from. For instance, Franz Liszt's variations on a theme by Bach. And the other way around too, when composers elaborated someone else's theme as a display of superiority, like the initial theme of the famous Diabelli's variations, of which Beethoven himself said it was a cobbler's patch, before he turned it into one of his most celebrated works. For this video, I chose an already composed theme, the College Hornpipe, an anonymous 18th century popular tune, which is also known as the Sailor's Hornpipe, due to its historical ties with the British Royal Navy, given that hornpipe stanzas were especially popular among sailors back then. The tune is composed as a short rounded binary form, with an initial theme of 8 bars, a 4 bars long contrasting middle section, and a reprise of the last 4 bars of the initial theme. Understanding our theme. Before even starting to work on our variations, first, we need to make sure we understand how our initial theme works, and this essentially means 2 things: harmonic and motivic analysis. Harmony stands as the backbone of our composition. The main theme and the subsequent variations will share the basic harmonic plan, as if a group of buildings had the very same inner structure but differed in their coding. This is the basic harmonic analysis of the initial theme's first 8 bars. First thing we must understand is the implicit hierarchy that lies behind this little colorful chaos. Changes of harmony that happen on the first beat of a bar, as well as those that happen right before a cadence, are considered the most essential ones. Changes of harmony that happen on the third beat of the bar, assuming we are in triple or quadruple meter, occupy a second level in the hierarchy, while the rest are considered as, more or less, non-essential. The second important thing to understand is the harmonic function of each chord. There are 3 types of functions within the classical music harmonic syntax: tonic, subdominant, and dominant. Tonic function represents tonal stability associated with the beginning and end of a piece, and its role is fulfilled by the first degree of the scale, either major or minor. The 6th degree in major mode keys, and the 3rd degree in minor mode keys, can also fulfill this function eventually, except in final cadences. Dominant function, on the other hand, represents harmonic tension. The 5th degree of the scale is the main dominant function chord, followed by the 7th degree, which is considered as an incomplete version. Secondary dominants, diminished 7ths and augmented 6th chords also fall into this category. And finally the subdominant function, which lies somewhere in between the tonic and the dominant functions. The 2nd and 4th scale degrees are the main subdominant function chords. In minor mode keys we can also find the 6th degree, the lowered 2nd degree and the lowered 7th degree fulfilling this role. The 3rd degree in major mode keys is somewhat undefined between tonic and subdominant function, and in classical music it's mostly used as a diatonic passing chord. With regard to harmonic progressions, while tonic and subdominant chords can be followed by any function, it's important to keep in mind that dominant function chords in the classical era can only be followed by tonic functions or another dominant. So this means that progressions such as 5th-4th, that are perfectly normal in today's music, are to be avoided according to classical music historical practice. With all this in mind, we can try and include some harmonic changes by a process of chord substitution. This means changing one chord for another that fulfills the same harmonic role, for instance, a fourth-degree chord for a second-degree chord, both working as subdominants. By doing this, we can add harmonic variety to our variations without substantially changing the harmonic structure. In this case, I'll try and modify the following chords by analog function chords and see what happens. We notice the changes, but the musical message is essentially the same, which is what we're looking for. Now, with regard to motivic analysis, we should focus on identifying those melodic and rhythmic elements that stand as characteristic, as opposed to conformative, which are those elements that could be interchanged from one piece to another. In this tune, the first obvious characteristic element is this short upbeat motive, which repeats a total of 12 times in just 8 measures, also appearing in a varied form in measure 7. Just like with chord substitution, we can play around with motives and introduce slight changes to see what happens. Notice that I only modified the melodic direction of the motive 1, while I kept everything else intact, and yet this could already work as a very basic variation, proving that even the slightest modification can make a huge impact if done properly. The other important motive, which I'll name motive number 2, is related to these 3 repeated notes. Just like in the previous example, we can re-elaborate this motive in all kinds of creative ways and get away with it, as long as something else still resembles the original tune. In this other example, I synthesized both motives in one and played with it. As you can see, possibilities are unlimited. Topics. There are 2 types of topics involving theme and variations in the classical era, which are an essential complement to everything explained up to this point with regard to harmony and motivic crafting. Rhythm topics revolve around 2 main groups, those that only modify the notes' lengths, and those which modify the rhythm patterns. Within the first group we've got the augmentation, which is the lengthening of the notes' durations. And the diminution, which is the shortening of the notes' durations. In practice, instead of a literal diminution, which would simply result in doubling up the tempo, composers normally used what I call figurative diminution, in which the tempo is kept but the melody is ornamented with smaller value notes, giving the impression of a faster pace. With regard to changes in the rhythm patterns, there are plenty of options, but these are the most common ones within the classical repertoire. Triplets, offbeat notes, syncopation, and dotted rhythms. It was customary that at least a couple of the variations were based on some of these rhythmic patterns. I suggest using these rhythmic resources in moderation, or we risk making our variations sound like one of those piano studies that everybody dislikes. Character topics are related to stereotyped moods, more than to specific motivic elements, even though they may still play a relevant role in some of them. The main topics within this group are the slow variation, the minor mode variation, the scherzo type, and the brilliant variation. The slow variation is, as its name suggests, a contrasting slower tempo variation, which could range from very slow tempi, like adagio, to more moderate ones. This variation is not only an opportunity to explore the expressive side of the main theme, especially if it was a fast one like in our case, but also a contrasting section in its own, usually appearing around the last third of the set of variations, as a preparation to the more energetic ones that will normally put the work to an end. In my case, I chose a moderate tempo and a gallant character for my variation, with a variant of the Alberti bass as accompaniment, which gives it some really charming and naive vibes. The minor mode variation is another highly stereotyped contrasting mood type, which doesn't need to be sad or tragic, as it could include some comic elements as well. Anyhow, this variation is the perfect excuse for some harmonic experimentation. The scherzo type, which means joke in Italian, is another kind of variation which I link to the late classical period, and it's characterized by its dark and sarcastic humor, the search for abrupt contrasts, and a self-conscious lack of sophistication. Notice the harsh sound and the clumsy use of the imitation in this variation, as well as this abrupt contrast near the end, where out of a sudden the musical texture switched to a foxbordin, a series of first inversion chords characteristic of the Renaissance music, which austere tone sounds ironic and totally out of context here. And finally, the brilliant variation, which is one of the most technically demanding ones, and it's usually left for the end. This variation is meant as a virtuosistic display, but also as an energetic ending variation, which behaves as what in other contexts would be a coda. The ways to approach to this kind of variation are multiple and depend on the historical period and the composer's instrumental skills, but it's common to find quick raising arpeggios, fast scales, or sped-up accompaniments. Never underestimate the value of a fast accompaniment when it comes to making even the simplest melody sound epic. General layout. How many variations should we include? One thing to keep in mind from the historical perspective is that writing down variations was a strict editorial practice, which composers only did when they actually wanted to publish their works for economic reasons. Up until the mid-19th century, the main context for variations was the improvisation, which was considered a basic musical skill and an essential part of every composer's basic training. In other words, limitations regarding the number and difficulty of the variations differed drastically from the commercial score, which was meant to be bought mostly by non-professional musicians for private use, to the actual composer's improvisations, which were meant as a display of virtuosistic skills, and could take as long as they wanted. On average, the number of variations in commercial scores tend to range from 6 to 12, but there are no fixed rules about it. However, we should be cautious about writing too many variations, because if there isn't enough variety between them, our audience will quickly get bored. With regard to the general layout, these are a few basic ideas that might help you to get a balanced composition, but that are by no means absolute rules. First, look for a contrasting alternation between variations. Don't place similar variations too close, whether we speak of character, rhythm, or anything else that might make them sound boring if played together. 2. Save your more sophisticated variations for the last third of the work. 3. Slow variations usually work better around the middle, especially if they are followed by more energetic ones. 4. It might be a good idea that your first and last variations are the closest ones to the original theme's melodic material. 5. Fast and technically demanding variations are ideal for the ending. And 6. Sometimes a brief coda can be added in the end or even a repetition of the initial theme, which is not too common, but serves as an original alternative to more normative endings, like in the famous Goldberg variations. That's all for today. Let me know if this video was helpful and which variations you liked the most. Thank you and see you next time.